I'm here with Michelle Hope. She is a national board certified teacher and an assistant principal in an elementary school in Memphis, Tennessee. And today we are talking about her article in the September issue of Educational Leadership magazine. The title of that is The Only F That Matters. And Michelle, of course, in this case, the F we are referring to is feedback. So my question is, why is feedback so important to a teacher's grading strategy?
So the purpose of feedback is to ensure that we're meeting students where they are. And it acknowledges that learning is a process and it's not measured by an end goal or an end product. And so the importance of feedback is that it really helps students know where they are and then helps move them along their learning continuum. And then also it helps teachers know where students are so that they can prepare to move students to where they need to go.
What does effective feedback look like versus ineffective feedback?
So, and they're very broad terms, you know, there's never really a wrong way to do something. And a lot of it really is just about what you want your goals to be. And so if our goal is student learning and moving students from where they are to where we want them to be at any given time, then effective feedback has to focus on where students are now and how we get them to the place where we want them to be, as opposed to, okay, we need to give them this letter grade or this percentage that indicates, you know, some kind of criteria that they have met or not met. And that doesn't mean that that criteria is not important. It is. It's how we determine how much, you know, they have learned. But, you know, I often found as a teacher that I would spend all this time, you know, writing comments on papers and really, you know, when you're a teacher and you've got 30 kids in a class, you spend so much time grading papers and quizzes and everything like that. And, you know, you put all kinds of feedback on them and then you give it back to the students and the only thing they focus on is that grade that's at the top and they don't pay attention to anything else that happens. And so if I didn't make it a really, you know, sort of intentional approach where I said, okay, well, let's look at the comments that I've given you, then they wouldn't. And parents wouldn't either. They didn't, you know, they weren't interested in everything that I had sort of given them in terms of feedback. They really just wanted that final grade. And so one of the very things that I did as an early teacher was I would have a reflection form that students would fill out every time they got back a piece of a test or a piece of work that they had completed. And on that, it would be, okay, what feedback did you get? And what are your next steps as a student in terms of moving, you know, forward? And so I found that helped them look more at the feedback than is at the grade. And then at some point, I also stopped putting those letter grades and percentage grades at the top of their papers because it really didn't matter. Yes, we still have to give grades. They still get report cards. Those report cards still matter. It's how they get into college. But at the end of the day, you know, I wanted my students to focus on how they could get you know, from where they were to where I wanted them to be and where they wanted to be as well. So that's what makes it more effective, you know, just really focusing on how can I move as opposed to what did I already do.
Were you also including like peer-to-peer feedback in that strategy as well?
So yes, I mean, certainly one of the things that I found was that especially if it's a piece of writing, if students look at their, you know, their peers' work first, then and I look at it second. Usually a lot of those small things that, you know, teachers get bogged down with, you know, they can get fixed quickly and then I can focus on the sort of broader feedback. And it's also effective in when I'm a student and I'm looking at another student's work, I see mistakes that they made, but then I realized I made the same mistakes as well. And so it becomes a really great sort of growing process. And so yes, often peer feedback was used, but really I typically tried to focus it only on write-in as opposed to, you know, tests and things like that.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So given the current situation and the fact that a lot of schools are still just teaching, you know, full-time remotely or in some sort of hybrid situation, what does feedback look like remotely? You know, how can a teacher, if they're not physically in the classroom with students, I know you can still provide written feedback, but how does that look? Like, how does that translate remotely?
So I actually think that the virtual space gives us the ideal sort of platform for more intentional feedback. And actually the very beginning of my article talks about I had a quote in there from a teacher that I had pulled from her Google Classroom. And it's really what inspired my whole approach to the article, because, in the spring, my district, we did go, as everybody did, we went to a virtual space. And because of the situation, we didn't require students to have work that was graded. So they were given work, but it wasn't graded for a report card grade. And so the teacher that I referenced, she really focused on, okay, how can I just give you feedback? I'm not going to give you a grade for this, but I want to give you feedback that is aligned to standards, that's aligned to a learning goal, but it doesn't equate to some kind of percentage at the end. And the learning that we saw happen and the motivation that kids felt from it was just outstanding. And so we were really grateful to kind of see that movement happen in our classrooms. And, it wasn't just one, it was a kind of a widespread trend where it wasn't required work. It wasn't work that was going to get you a grade. It was work that was going to get you feedback. And so that was really, powerful. And I think especially now, and my district is 100% virtual at this time. And so, students are getting assignments and they are going to get grades for those things. But because of the way that they're not getting sort of papers back, it means that we really can focus on giving them sort of more narrative-based feedback, whether it's just verbal, okay, this is the, one-on-ones that we can have now with students in that way, or if it's just written feedback that comes sort of inside of the platform. So we're using Microsoft Teams, and a lot of the features inside Microsoft Teams allow you to do that. The notebook inside of there allows you to sort of you can kind of record a little video of yourself or an audio of yourself giving feedback to students. And so I really, I think that the more that we can use those tools to kind of give students feedback that's not centered on a grade, I think that's really powerful.
Now, you talked just now about the video concept. So I guess one of my questions is, do you find that feedback's more effective if you're actually speaking it, or is written feedback more effective, or does it matter?
I don't think it matters as much, but what I'm noticing right now is that students like to see our faces. I think they're missing that human contact. And so when you open up your assignment and you see that your teacher's left you a little video message, it's so exciting to just press it and see your teacher speaking to you. And it feels very personal, and it is, because the teacher essentially has to record it per child. And so it's kind of neat to see that. And I think parents like to see that as well. It's very intentional. It's very specific to my child. And I think that the kids are really liking that, and that doesn't mean that written feedback is not just as effective. It absolutely can be. But for smaller children, they don't always kind of read into what you want them to get out of the feedback. And often what you can say, because they won't necessarily process that. And so, often feedback when it's written is like, great job. And that really doesn't help them, figure out, well, what's one thing I can do to make it better?
In your article, you talk a lot about different kinds of grading pitfalls that you see in schools and ways that schools can avoid those. So can you talk just about one, maybe like the one that you most commonly see, or, the one that you really hope that schools can eventually sort of turn over, and why it's a pitfall, and also what, schools could do to kind of get around that?
Right. And so, yes, there are several that I've sort of seen in my career as an instructional coach, and then as a school leader as well. And then even as a teacher, you kind of do trial and error and you realize, oh, that's just not quite working. But one of the things that I see is the biggest issue is what I call outsized grading for short assignments. And I speak as a teacher, I speak as a parent, because I've seen this, with my own children as well. But where you have an assignment that, maybe has 3 or 4 questions, but it's still scored out of 100. And so what happens is when a child, gets 1 or 2 questions wrong, it really just tanks their grade, because they, when you think about it as a percentage, 2 out of 4, well, that's 50%. But, given the way that often these assignments are structured, those questions can still measure the same standard or the same learning target. And so, they may have missed 1 step, But the fact that they've got those other two correct means that they understood the process. So they just, they made one small misstep that kind of led all the calculations or all of the, the questioning wrong, especially since, often these assignments kind of build on each other. If you get question one wrong, then, you'll also get question two wrong and so forth. And so that's the biggest thing that I see, that kind of outsized grading. And I understand why we do it. In terms of math, when we, report card grades are out of 100, it's so much easier to score when it's out of 100. It's easier to do the math that way. So I definitely understand why we do it. I think that it's just one of the biggest pitfalls that I see, because it really can hurt a student's overall grade. And even if, there are so many grades in a quarter, that means that that one F doesn't really affect them overall. There's damage that's done to their self-esteem along as well. And so in terms of overcoming that, one of the things that I mentioned in the article is to use a rubric approach. And the example that I give is for a math curriculum that offers examples of this. And we use Great Minds Eureka in our district, and they offer a really great rubric-based approach to grading math assignments that typically have that issue, where there may be, 3 questions and each question has 4 or 5 parts, but if they miss one part of it, then they're gonna, sort of see a decrease in their grade as they go through. However, the rubric kind of measures their learning on a scale of 1 through 4. And so it looks at the understanding as opposed to the level of correctness. And so I think that's extremely important. And that's the same thing for ELA or for science or for anything, that if we can sort of approach learning as that continuum, that 1 to 4 understanding as opposed to the level of correctness, then we'll see a change in how we award grades in the end. I think also it's just a case of where our mindset is as educators, where our students, where their mindset is. I talked about how they kind of focus in on that grade. Yeah. And parents too, if there's sort of that, oh, what is your report card grade? Does it have that A on it? Does it have that B on it? And I think we have to kind of shift away from that. And so that really just starts with schools. How are we approaching feedback? A lot of schools have moved towards more standards-based grading, and that's definitely a step towards that, where it becomes about, where is that student on the learning continuum, as opposed to how did they meet these criteria at this time? So I think just really kind of shifting our mindset and realizing that it's not about that final grade. It's not about, the product that comes at the end of something. That learning is a process, and that we have to be willing to push our students along that process so that they can reach a greater goal, and that it never stops. Just because I have A doesn't mean that I have reached the ultimate goal of my life or my grade or whatever it is. It's really about a process. And so once we shift in our minds and we kind of shift our student thinking, and then we shift our parents as well, I think we'll see some great things happen.
Yeah, just in editing this issue, have learned a lot about the ways that schools, like the culture of the school, and how so much of what we honor and what we award, things for in schools is all based on that final grade. Like, did you have the highest GPA? Did you get into the honor society? And so
right.
It's really interesting to think about it, like how ingrained it is. And so it's not an easy thing to make that switch.
Yes, absolutely. And I've seen some schools, responsive schools begin to move away from like those honors programs, like the every 6 weeks or every 9 weeks, those honors programs for everyone who's got an A, or having principals lists and things like that. I've seen schools move away from that model for that reason, because it's not about, how many A's you can get on your report card. It's really about where you are in the learning process, especially because really a lot of those grades can be subjective. Depending on what it took to get that A, or what it took to get that 100.